And welcome to the community conversation panel titled 9/11 Conspiracies Theory. And on behalf of the Walton Advisory Board, I'd like to welcome you. If you guys are interested in getting to know more about the Walton Advisory Board, I would encourage you guys all to come. We meet here at 5 o'clock on Wednesdays, and it's a real good time. I would like to introduce our panelists this evening. Starting out, we have Dr. Matt Orr, and he's an instructor of biology at the University of Oregon and teaches at the Central Oregon campus in Bend. Steve Mital is the founder and co-coordinator of the Environmental Leadership Program and the Environmental Studies Program here at the U of O. Dr. Dean Walton is an assistant professor and science librarian at the U of O. Dean will also be offering a freshman seminar titled Disaster Inquiries, Research into Catastrophes and Crisis Situations in 2007-2008. So, I'm going to hand it over to Kevin, and he's going to talk a little bit more about an annotated bibliography.
Thanks, Audrey. I just wanted to mention briefly that we've been collaborating with the U of O libraries. Dean and Matt were kind enough to put together an annotated bibliography of sources for this evening. We've got a hard copy for everybody here. There's also a URL link at the bottom of the front page to a library website that has a PDF version of this as well as other material relevant to tonight's panel. And this was also put together broadly by Barbara Jenkins, who's the head of the reference department, and Elizabeth Peterson, one of our humanities librarians that have been collaborating with us. So I'm going to pass this out, and I'm going to turn it over to Matt.
I'd like to use that microphone if I may.
Okay. Steve, do you want to say something?
Before we before we get into the presentation, I just wanted to provide you a little bit of background and context as to why why we organized this presentation this evening. About a year ago, I stumbled across some of the information that's going to be presented to you this evening, and like lots of people who stumble across it for the very first time, you really become quite overwhelmed and wowed and amazed by this wealth of information that really makes your head spin, and you start to wonder several things. A, is this true? Is there really some kind of 9/11 conspiracy? But maybe more importantly, why haven't I seen this information presented in an objective and safe environment through the media, and vice versa? Why hasn't there been a large national debate on this? Why do we so quickly assume that whatever the official story is must be the correct one and kind of move on with our lives? And I was really taken with how easily I had moved on with my life after the initial shock of 9/11 wore off, and just kind of went along and felt that whatever the story they told me was probably accurate. Then I stumbled across this wealth of information on the internet and realized that there's something really missing in our society, and it's the opportunity to debate freely like we're going to this evening. Normally we would expect this to be carried out by the media and certainly our government institutions to do very exacting investigative work, and I think in this case it really hasn't happened. And so I know Matt knows quite a bit about this information, and so it was really my idea I approached Kevin and thought this would be a nice venue to get you guys to think critically about the issue. And we're not going to be able to prove or disprove what happened on September the 11th, 2001 tonight, right? That's not going to happen. There's no way to do that conclusively in any one shape or form. The hope, really, my hope in any case, what a successful presentation would be about, is to get you all to think more critically, if you haven't already, partly about the issue of 9/11, and then more broadly about how information is disseminated in our nation, what it takes to uphold the democratic institutions that we all were more or less born into and support, but don't necessarily see or don't necessarily have the power to support or prevent from eroding further. So those are some of the bigger issues besides the 9/11 concern. 9/11 happens to be a classic case study in what happens when we all just kind of take the official story and keep going and don't investigate it critically ourselves. So that's what really tonight is about. It's not so much about deciding what happened on that night, but by presenting information, thinking about where information comes from and how to sift through it yourself and come to conclusions, as well as what to do about information once you've come to some sense of, well, what you think might happen, or further investigation might be necessary, how do you act on that? Those are some of the things I hope we can discuss this evening. So I'll leave it at that and let Matt start.
I'm more accustomed to lecturing standing up, so that's what I'm going to do. I'll try to stay out of people's way. Can that be straightened, or is it just stuck on a tilt there, the screen there?
I think it's tilted so that people on this side of the room can see it.
Okay. As Steve was saying, there are a lot of open questions about 9/11. A lot of these have not been addressed in a thorough fashion. That's one thing that I think you'll probably walk away from tonight realizing. And one thing I really want to stress is that this room here is not going to figure out what happened on 9/11. And I'm really more interested in raising questions and looking at patterns that are suspicious and that have not been investigated thoroughly. For instance, the 9/11 Commission, one of their implicit mandates was to not cast blame, and they never anywhere explicitly raised the hypothesis of this possibly being an inside job. So that is what we're going to do tonight, though, is raise up the possibility that 9/11 was a false flag attack. And I'll start by looking at just a really brief overview of what is a false flag attack and a couple of examples. Speak briefly about what a motive for a false flag attack on 9/11 might have been. Look at the hijackers a little bit and see if mainstream news accounts of the hijackers really fit a sort of more meta-analysis that we seem to get from the government and from the mainstream media about who these people were. And then finally, look a little bit at the military stand down on 9/11. So that's the first part of my presentation tonight. False flag attacks. A false flag attack is an attack that's made to look like it's been conducted by another entity when the actual entity behind it is really what's in control. A good example of a false flag attack, so we have a history of this in our country, at least records that are now publicly available on the U.S. Archives and Records Administration webpage. So you can go straight to the U.S. Archives and read about Operation Northwoods, 1962. It was put together, it never reached fruition, but it was signed off on by all of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, which are the leaders of every branch of the U.S. military, signed off on this document. It was put together to speculate on ways that they might be able to foster public support for an invasion of Cuba. One quote from the document is that casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. The story was broken by a reporter doing a larger book. The only place I've seen it mentioned anywhere in the mainstream media is on an ABC News webpage. So it has gotten just touched on in the mainstream media, but barely. They speak in the Operation Northwoods about a single integrated time-phased plan. And so this starts, think then in terms of time phase, a series of possible attacks or false flag operations, not necessarily just one event. One of the things that they mentioned in the document is we could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. They mentioned the possibility of blowing up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blaming it on Cuba. Swapping a remote-controlled drone with a civil aircraft and blowing up the actual aircraft over Cuba, blaming it on Cuba. Staging fake attacks on the U.S. base in Guantanamo, and also painting an F-86 to look like a Cuban MiG, which is a Cuban fighter, and to harass civilian airliners. This document lay undiscovered until about 2002, after 9/11, 2001. And like I said, it's now publicly available information. You can find it on the in the U.S. Archives. So another thing to think about, well, how is Operation Northwoods potentially relevant to what we're dealing with tonight? Well, as far as precedents go, here we have a major sort of precedent plan here for a major time-phased false flag series of operations designed to look like one thing when in fact they were the other, designed by the US government. And in fact, as far as precedents for some sort of a large terrorist event on US soil goes, we don't really have any actual terrorist events. We don't have any documents from actual terrorists planning these events. What we have is Operation Northwoods. And so in terms of considering what happened on 9/11, I think this really levels the playing field in terms of our thoughts of let's take a serious look at what happened on 9/11 and let's weigh both of these possibilities equally, given this precedent that maybe 9/11 was a false flag attack. And when you start to weigh these two possibilities equally, the official version and the false flag version, and then you start to get into some of the evidence becomes particularly eye-opening. For instance, right after 9/11, there were the anthrax attacks. Well, they targeted 2 Democratic skeptics of the Patriot Act. They were mailed to their congressional offices. And we know now, based on investigation, that this was the Ames strain of anthrax developed in 1981 in Texas. It was held at U.S. AMRED in Fort Detrick, Maryland, a secure U.S. Army medical research facility. And since then, according to the Washington Post, and this is where the mainstream media can become useful in terms of putting our picture together, we can actually find all the evidence we need straight out of the mainstream media. And in a minute here, I'll show you a book that Mark has brought by, which contains a lot of that information. So the Washington Post reports that since the 1980s, it was distributed to only 5 labs under strict controls. And so the source of the anthrax attacks, and remember now, we're weighing these two hypotheses equally. Is this a time-phased, false flag, terrorist series of events, or is it what we've been told it is? Well, we've got something where the actual material that was used in this attack came straight from a U.S. military facility. Okay. The last one I'm going to cover here, there are a lot of them, and maybe this is a good point to also mention that I have a short course that's available through the bibliography where there's more detail on some of this information. But the last sort of false flag event, just to carry it through post 9/11 now, is this proactive, preemptive operations group. This story was broken by the Los Angeles Times. It was also, actually, I think it might have been broken by UPI and picked up by the Los Angeles Times. But that's about as far as it made it in the mainstream media. No other news sources gave this much coverage. In fact, Project Censored, which is a media watchdog group out of Sonoma State University, called this one of its top stories of that year. 2002 Pentagon plan, the mission was to stimulate reactions among terrorists to justify counterattack by U.S. forces. And so again, the idea is to goad people here into conducting terrorist type events and then reacting to those events. Okay, so then you can ask yourself, who exactly is behind an event if they have been goaded into conducting it and the event has been allowed to occur? Stimulate. So in this case, it would be stimulate. They would identify individuals that would potentially want to conduct these attacks and stimulate them into doing it. A recent thing, just to diverge for just a minute here, is a court case that just wrapped up in New York City. There was a Pakistani immigrant who was just given a very severe sentence. He had been under the guidance of an undercover New York City police officer. This came out in the trial, who was posing as a senior Muslim cleric and telling this guy, you know, Abu Ghraib was horrible, how are you going to respond? And had gotten this guy to the point where he said he was willing to conduct a bombing on a Manhattan subway during the 2004 Republican convention. And the undercover New York City police officer actually was providing him the materials to conduct the operation. At which point the guy had second thoughts, and when he pulled out, he was then arrested for supposedly concocting this attack. And the trial was just recently reported on Democracy Now! in a fair amount of detail. Okay, well, what would the motives be for conducting? I mean, So in the case of Operation Northwoods, we have a clear motive. Let's incite public support for an invasion of Cuba. What would possible motives for 9/11 be? These are questions that could potentially be investigated further if we were going to have a real, investigation with subpoena power. So one possible motive here is Iraq, and we've actually got a paper trail back to when Clinton was in the White House. This is the Project for a New American Century. Some of its members, and in fact, some of the people who signed this letter were Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, and Richard Armitage. You can go straight to the PNAC's own website to read this document. And one of the things they say in this letter to Clinton is the only acceptable strategy is one that eliminates the possibility that Iraq will be able to use or threaten to use weapons of mass destruction. In the near term, this means a willingness to undertake military action as diplomacy is clearly failing. Okay, so what do we see after 9/11? We saw an invasion of Iraq justified by 9/11. Some military motivations, a 2000 document from the same think tank. They call for world military dominance. The Soviets have been sort of pushed out of the way. What are we going to do? We're going to solidify U.S. world dominance. However, they say the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Okay, these are the people writing this document, are the people that were in power with the Bush administration on 9/11. Let's see. Oh, part of this had to do with, in terms of the big changes that they were looking for, had to do with a severely increased military budget. Oil. So this is a 2000 document from the James Baker Institute. James Baker was Secretary of State for the first George Bush. He was part of George Bush Jr.'s transition team into the White House. And he was also part of the legal team that helped Bush get appointed by the Supreme Court in the Bush versus Gore trial. So from James Baker's Institute, 2000, tight energy markets have increased U.S. and global vulnerability to disruption and provided adversaries undue potential influence over the price of oil. Again, you can go to their own website and read these documents. Okay, so post 9/11, we see a lot of this wish list being fulfilled, and a lot of it being driven by 9/11 as justification. We see Iraq invaded. We see the U.S. military budget up 32%. So it's up by, this is not the total budget, this is what it has increased by. It now exceeds the combined military budget of the next 20 largest militaries in the world. We've got an Afghan pipeline in the works. That's been stalled by the failure to conquer, actually, the problems that they're having in Afghanistan. But we know through a report in an Israeli newspaper that U.S. military bases are going up along the proposed pipeline route in Afghanistan. We've got increased military bases in oil-rich regions, including Iraq. And we've got an incredible amount of war profiteering going on through groups that are connected to both the president. This is the Carlyle Group. It's a private investment bank that the Bush administration is heavily invested in. And Halliburton, which is Dick Cheney's ex-company. Okay. So we've got a precedent. We've got a motive. Let's start looking at some of the actual patterns associated with 9/11. I would consider the anthrax attacks to be one of those patterns. So we've covered one already. But let's look at the hijackers a little bit. So what we've been told about the hijackers is that these were Muslim fundamentalists who were so devoutly Islamic that they were ready to kill for their cause and sacrifice their lives as suicide pilots. Well, the history of Al-Qaeda actually goes back to pre-9/11. It actually goes back even before what I'm going to talk about here, but I'm going to enter in here in the 1980s. When the CIA basically the CIA equivalent in Pakistan, it's called the Inter Services Intelligence, ISI, Inter Services Intelligence, coordinated to expel the Soviets from Afghanistan. And they did it by fostering Muslim fundamentalism in Afghanistan. This actually included even sending textbooks in that incited a lot of militaristic thinking. Another thing that they did is that they imported a lot of radicals into the U.S. for military training and then sent them back to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. Okay, this was called Operation Cyclone. You can Wikipedia it, but it's basically common knowledge. This is not something, you might not be reading it in the paper every day, but there's dozens of sources where you can read about this. It's not controversial. So here we've got Michael Springman, who was the head of the US consulate in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia at that time, back in the 80s during Operation Cyclone. And on a BBC Newsnight report, which you can actually Google and watch the report online, Greg Palast interviews Michael Springman, and he says, in Saudi Arabia, I was repeatedly ordered by high-level State Department officials to issue visas to unqualified applicants. And he later found that this was being done by the CIA and that these were basically Operation Cyclone trainees. So Jeddah here, this US consulate in Jeddah is an entry port for Muslim fundamentalists to get into the US and train during the war in Afghanistan. Why is that relevant to 9/11? Well, 15 of the 19 9/11 hijackers got their visas from that same consulate. The head of the Pakistani ISI on 9/11 was in Washington, D.C. on the morning of 9/11, dining with Porter Goss, who's currently the head of our CIA. Okay, this is straight out of a book written by Senator Bob Graham of Florida. The head of the ISI authorized a $100,000 wire transfer to the person that's thought to be the lead hijacker under the official version of events, Mohammed Atta, a week before 9/11. This was reported in the India Times and the Wall Street Journal. So we have these same kinds of CIA, Pakistani ISI, Jeddah consulate connections that actually have a much longer history that go back long before 9/11. They're active on 9/11, and the incredible thing about this is that none of this has been investigated. Now, think for yourself for a minute. What would have happened if the Times of India and the Wall Street Journal had discovered that Saddam Hussein had wired $100,000 to lead hijacker Mohammed Atta in the weeks before 9/11? Do you think you would have heard about that? The 9/11 Commission report. Now, I'm not going to say too much about the 9/11 Commission report. You can go into my short course, or we could talk about it more later. But this is typical of the whitewash that went on during the 9/11 Commission report. We have a direct money trail here between the Pakistani ISI and Mohammed Atta. The 9/11 Commission report determines or concludes on page 172, this is a direct quote, to date, the U.S. government has not been able to determine the origin of the money used for the 9/11 attacks. Ultimately, the question is of little practical significance. Now, follow the money is sort of a main mode of operation in terms of trying to investigate a crime. What was financing this crime? The 9/11 Commission wasn't interested. We're told that these guys were surprise suicide pilots. They took us totally by surprise, that they were suicidal, and that they were pilots. Well, let's question every one of those things. First of all, surprise. Hani Hanjour had been tracked by the FBI. So Hani Hanjour is the person who allegedly flew the plane into the Pentagon. Had been tracked by the FBI for 3 years before 9/11. They knew his exact address, his phone number, and even what car he drove. This is from ABC News. From the AP, an AP newspaper report that came out a few years ago, and this is Navy Captain Scott Philpott, and there was another one, Anthony Schaefer. These were two military intelligence officers who were part of an operation called Able Danger, and their claim is that they had identified Mohammed Atta and 3 other hijackers a year before 9/11. Okay, so his quote here is, "My story has remained consistent. Atta was identified by Able Danger in early 2000. 2 other hijackers were living with an FBI informant in San Diego beginning in early 2000. The CIA were aware of them ever since they attended an Al-Qaeda meeting in Malaysia in January 2000. Those are both from Newsweek." What about, so were these people really here as a surprise? Were they really unknown prior to 9/11? What about suicide? University of Florida religion professor Richard Foltz states, "It is incomprehensible that a person could drink and go to a strip bar one night, then kill themselves the next day in the name of Islam. People who would kill themselves for their faith would come from very strict Islamic ideology. Something here does not add up." That's from the Florida Sentinel. So, what is he talking about? Does anybody remember these stories about Marwan Al-Sehi and Muhammad Atta are seen entering the Hollywood, Florida sports bar Shuckham's Already Drunk. They proceeded to drink even more hard alcohol there. This was in the days prior to 9/11. That's from the AP. The Daily Mail. Atta and Al-Sehi are seen at Sunrise 251, a bar in Palm Beach, Florida. They spend $1,000 in 45 minutes on Krug and Perrier Jouet champagne. Atta is with a tall, busty brunette in her late 20s. Al-Sehi is with a shortish blonde. Both women are known locally as regular companions of high rollers. And I'm just going to stop for a minute here and mention a book. Unfortunately, it's really the only good, I should say the only thorough investigative look at what these guys were up to in Florida in the year preceding 9/11. So it would be nice if we had an investigative reporter from a major U.S. news outlet doing this. Nobody is. And so this is Welcome to Terrorland. It's Daniel Hopsicker's book. I think it has some pretty sound strengths to it. He actually went down there and interviewed people that were associated with the hijackers leading up to 9/11. These reports here are utterly consistent with what Hopsicker found when he went down there and talked to people that were living in the same apartment buildings as these people, the people who were dating these guys, but virtually everybody, the bartenders that had been serving these guys. People said we thought they were mob. They looked like spies. They were extremely well dressed. And they were also associating with individuals from all sorts of different places, including Europe, Germany, and they were also working out of airfields that are associated with CIA-run proprietary operations that are taking place in the drug trade, all under the radar of public knowledge. Nawaf al-Hamzi and Khaled Almidar often frequented Cheetah's, a nude bar in San Diego, and this is the quote I like the best here. The mayor of Patterson, New Jersey, says of the 6 hijackers who stayed there, nobody ever saw them at mosques, but they liked the go-go clubs. That's from Newsweek. Were they pilots? Hani Hanjour was reported to the Federal Aviation Administration in February 2001 after instructors at Pan Am International Flight Academy in Phoenix found his piloting skills so shoddy that they questioned whether his pilot's license was genuine. Okay, so that's in the months prior to the attack. Another instructor of his in 2001, he could not fly at all. There's also information like this on other so-called, supposed terrorists who were in flight training. Zacharias Moussaoui, for instance, the person who they called the 20th hijacker for a while, one of his flight instructors concluded that he was merely a gentleman who enjoyed spending time in the company of pilots. Now, you might have heard a little bit about the Popular Mechanics book that came out recently, supposedly debunking some of these theories, some of these alternative theories. They call Hanjour the most skilled pilot of the hijackers. They try to build a case that he was a decent pilot. There's been a rebuttal book. There actually is a very recent book out now by David Ray Griffin called Debunking 9/11 Debunking. It's on the bibliography sheet that's been handed out to you. And it pretty much fillets the Popular Mechanics book and I think does a good job of debunking a lot of the issues that are raised there. In particular, some of these issues around the pilots. So did Hanjour perform this 270-degree steep downward spiral to hit the Pentagon? Was he able to actually pull this off? This is Ralph Omholt, a captain qualified 757 pilot. The idea that an unskilled pilot could have flown this trajectory is simply too ridiculous to consider. There's actually now a group coming out called Pilots for 9/11 Truth. Shortly after that, there'll be engineers and architects for 9/11 Truth. And it's also worth noting that the Popular Mechanics book, which spends some time trying to cover this issue about the flight competence of the hijackers, interviews one flight instructor, and the only question that they really ask that person is with respect to whether they could have pointed the planes in the right direction once they were hijacked. They don't ask questions about whether a maneuver like this could have been performed by an individual who was considered so incompetent by his instructors. The last thing here is the military stand down. Now this is a document that came out during the 9/11 Commission report, the Presidential Daily Brief, dated August 6, 2001, so it's shortly before 9/11. It talked about one possible perpetrator of an attack, Al-Qaeda, 2 areas, Washington, D.C. and New York, 1 method, hijacking, and 1 target building, the World Trade Center. And so if we're to believe this document, then the U.S. was adequately forewarned. There's also, if you look in the mainstream 9/11 terror timeline, do you mind if I show this to them really quickly? He takes a lot of mainstream sources here, and you can find mainstream news sources in which they talk about warnings from foreign countries about 9/11 coming. So it's not like this came from absolutely nowhere. And notice this didn't come out till the 9/11 Commission hearing, so it was really pulling teeth for people to realize that we were forewarned. Now, keep that in mind. If the U.S. government was forewarned on 9/11, keep that in mind in the context of their actual behavior of some of our highest military officials on 9/11. So we've got our commander-in-chief. He enters a classroom after the first World Trade Center crash. Now, this is after reading the presidential daily brief about a month earlier. He sits for an additional 5 to 10 minutes after the second crash. Secretary of Defense continued with his usual intelligence briefing after the second plane hit the World Trade Center. And he proclaimed that he didn't really know anything was especially amiss until there was an explosion at the Pentagon, which is the building he was in at the time. And his reaction was not to either get out of the way of a possible additional crash at the Pentagon. No, he knew that 2 had already gone into the World Trade Center. 1 had gone into the Pentagon. So at that point, you would think the Secretary of Defense would either go into sort of high military mode, or he would at least get out of that building or get out of harm's way. And instead, he went out right to the crash site and loitered around on the Pentagon lawn. This is according to his own story, helping to load people onto stretchers. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Richard Myers. He was inside Senator Max Cleland's office, according to him, apparently unaware of anything until after the 3rd plane hit its target, Pentagon. The head of the National Military Command Center. This is a good one because the National Military Command Center is what links up the air traffic controllers, civilian air traffic controllers, with the military. So it's standard protocol for them for emergencies to be channeled through the National Military Command Center so that something that's happening to a civilian airliner can be picked up by the military. We know that this is not controversial, that the National Military Command Center is sort of the relay point there. So Montague Winfield, who was a general, head of the National Military Command Center, 5 minutes into the first hijacking, hands his post to an inexperienced substitute. That came out during the 9/11 Commission hearings. I don't believe it's in the final report. There's a lot that happened in the 9/11 Commission hearings that is not in the report. A lot of whistleblowing, the quotes from Philpott and Schaefer from Able Danger about knowing Muhammad Atta. You'd think that would be something that might get put in the final report. All that information was censored, didn't come out till later. You've got another FBI whistleblower, didn't come out until later. So there's a lot missing from that report. Andrews Air Force Base is 10 miles from Washington, D.C. According to its own website, it had 2 squadrons of combat-ready aircraft on 9/11. The time between the first hijacking and the crash at the Pentagon was over an hour. And yet there was no air defense raised over Washington, D.C. Keep in mind the warnings, the presidential daily brief about hijacking attacks on Washington, D.C. and New York City. This is Robert Bowman. He's got a PhD in aeronautics and nuclear engineering from Caltech. He was the head of the Star Wars programs under Ford and Carter, and he had a 22-year Air Force career. And he says, if our government had merely done nothing, and I say that as an old interceptor pilot, and I know the drill, I know what it takes, I know how long it takes, I know what the procedures are. If our government had merely done nothing and allowed normal procedures to happen on that morning of 9/11, the Twin Towers would still be standing and thousands of Americans would still be alive. Now, this is another, there's a website on your sheet, patriotsquestion911.com. There's a lot of good statements like this from people who, top intelligence officials, military officials, people in academia. It's really a website that's very worth consulting. I think you'll be pretty surprised to see what people are saying, but which isn't getting widely disseminated. I'm going to wrap up the first part of my presentation there and turn it over to Dean. you want me to bring up your PowerPoint?
Yeah, I'll probably actually stand up there too.
Let's see.
Actually, I want to get one other thing going there too.
You know how to work that?
Let's see.
You pull this thing towards you, I think. It's either toward or away. And here's the mic.
I'm going to escape for 1 second and bring up this other document here too first. Probably take a slightly different approach in this. I'll be taking a slightly different approach in this conversation tonight. I am not an expert in this field by any means. I am here only because of a recent interest to create some learning materials for this talk. And having done so, I was approached and said, hey, would you be willing to participate based on sort of my gut feel of what I read? And so in looking through these materials, I was seeing mention of several conspiracies, those regarding whether a plane or a missile actually hit the Pentagon, and whether the Twin Towers were taken down by the airplanes, or whether there was something in addition to those airplanes that helped bring those buildings down. And in this case, whether there was actually bombs placed in those buildings ahead of time. And these are some theories that have been put out there on the internet. Some people consider these to be sort of other sort of red herrings to get away from the important ideas that Matt is talking about tonight. And I can't say whether that is true or not. I do think that the concepts that Matt is talking about are very important concepts, and we really need to investigate these things. But I'm going to go through the approach of someone who's very new to this field, who used library resources, the books I had access to, and actually some of the databases, and one in particular was the AccuNet database, which is a host of AP photographs. And so that'll be my sort of first look. Here we have a picture of the Washington, D.C. area. This is an area where I grew up. I grew up just a little bit north of here, and I actually lived about 2 miles from here. Well, one of the theories says that, geez, you know, again, the plane that hit the Pentagon didn't exist, that it was a cruise missile or something like that that struck the Pentagon. And so, all right, I think we need to turn on the light again for the power for the presentation. All right. Shut down.
You might just have to miss some of the slide material. It's not going to pick it up.
All right. So without the slides, really, I don't have much to say because that's where all my talk is coming from. Okay.
This is going to take a second for it
All right.
to warm back up. Sorry.
Well, so we're looking at this issue of whether it was a cruise missile hitting the Pentagon. And again, some people said this is sort of this red herring. We really could probably quickly sort of figure out, well, a plane did take off from Dulles Airport. There were 64 people on this plane. That plane disappeared. Radar shows it leaving Dulles, heading out west, then turning around, at which point the transponder was turned off and it was mysteriously, disappeared, which I do think is interesting. But we do know it turned around. First bit. Okay. Right. I mean, this is something that was not missed. We look at the damage here. If a cruise missile had hit this locality, it would have detonated here. But people say, oh, there's a hole blown in a wall back here in building, or we'll say ring C. We have E, D, and C. And again, if it was a cruise missile it couldn't have punched through here because it would have blown up right here. Instead, what you have is photographs showing basically the most massive part of an airplane, the landing gear, which is flying at 500 miles an hour, basically hits here and punches its way through. And there's photographs of that. We'll look at the fact that, let's see, did I go through? The size of the plane. We're talking about a Boeing 757, which has a wingspan about 150 feet. 6 of those planes could line up along the edge of one edge of the Pentagon. And here we have a hole that is much smaller than this 150 feet. And people say, hey, if it was a plane, these are again some of the people who are promoting the idea that it was a missile, there would have been a much bigger hole. If we look at the base, which we can't see very well, the light on, we do see that we have a whole series of supports that are right here. So the area where the plane is believed to have crashed down here is larger than this area here. And if we look at, if we jump back to, say, 1945, July 28th, when a B-25 bomber actually flew into the Empire State Building, here's a plane that has a wingspan of 67 feet. When it hit the Empire State Building, it only punched the hole 18 feet wide. The wings being fairly weak, folded right back, and only the center part of the plane punched in. The same thing happens here. We have a hole which is about a third of the size of the airplane, with the most fragile parts of the plane crumbling up, also containing the fuel, likely burning. Let's see, back here. There's comments about whether there was, again, more evidence of the plane, since some people say it was not seen. We have pictures of landing gear inside the Pentagon and pictures of the outside of the plane fuselage on the ground. Other people have claimed, well, these photographs have been faked. Well, okay, I can't prove whether they're faked or not, but now we have a whole series of what might be people involved to, we'll say, carry out this, this conspiracy or charade. We need to have people who launched the cruise missile, people who got rid of the other airplane. If the other airplane didn't land here, it was the missile, where'd the other airplane go? And we have all this material that's sitting here. And in fact, the sad thing is that we had 64 passengers on that plane who all had friends, family who were missed, and their remains were found here and are now back in those families' hands. So I'm fairly confident that it was a plane and not a missile. So let's move on to, yes?
You said the remains have been found from these people?
Yes.
But the plane was completely disintegrated, but then they still found the remains.
Well, the parts of planes have been found there, and the remains of the 64 people were found. Not all of them have been identified, but a majority of them have been identified and returned to their respective families. Now, you gotta think that a plane has this aluminum body which actually can disintegrate and melt pretty quickly. It is not a nice rigid steel structure. It is a very lightweight structure designed to fly. And boy, when it catches on fire, in fact, you look at the paper, it was about a month and a half ago, a plane caught fire in Indonesia. And you should see what happened to that plane, just as this is something that's on the ground burning. It didn't hit anything, it just landed, caught fire, and basically just burns and done with nothing. All right, so let's move on to the World Trade Centers. Here are the World Trade Centers, basically about 1972. We have Building 4, Building 5, Building 6. Right in between here we have Building 7, which was the building which had the bunker for the New York FEMA group. Another view from up top, again, 4, 5, 6. Here's the base. Let's see if we can get that off. To the next one. Base of Building 7 right here. And this caused some controversy later on. And can I get rid of that? Okay, I think we're good. Here we have the explosion of the second tower. one of the things that people were concerned about with the planes hitting the World Trade Centers is that supposedly the World Trade Centers were designed to withstand a plane flying into them. And my first thought of that, being new to this field, was like, well, what other examples can I look towards for something like this? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that just last week was the anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. Here's this plane, this ship that was built that was unsinkable, and yet it sunk. And I went and looked at some other books, and I found that there's a whole series of buildings: the Kemper Auditorium, the Kemper Arena, the Post Auditorium, and the Hartford Coliseum, all big steel buildings. They all fell, and they weren't designed to fall in that sense. The architects didn't mean for them to fall. None was hit by an aircraft, yet they still failed. So it's not surprising that some of these buildings do fail. What is amazing is the fact that the buildings stood as long as they did. And when I read at least the synopsis of the NSIT report, which is this, it's a 10,000-page report compiled by several hundred engineers and people with the PhD in material sciences. Their view from this was that critical insulation on the buildings was knocked away when the planes hit, that the steel girders then began to heat up, and it really just takes a few hundred degrees above, actually an increase of about 300 degrees centigrade from the room temperature for that steel to lose about half its strength in these buildings. And what happened there is that you have a plane that's coming in, 10-degree angle above horizontal. When it hits the building, it is driving material down towards the base of the building. You have girders that are buckling. You have the heat, which then heats up the girders. They begin to fail. And suddenly you have what amounts to about a 30-story section of a building beginning to creep downward. And suddenly it begins to move. And that inertia is enough to then really bring the rest of the buildings down. If you also think of the effect of, say you're staying next to a highway and a semi comes by. Here we have something that is traveling at 60 miles an hour, has a cross-sectional area of maybe about 100 square feet. That can buffet you and cause you to just jostle a little bit. Now imagine something that is moving at 3 times that speed, at 186 miles an hour as it's coming down, that has a cross-sectional area that is 430 times the size of that semi. And now you have something that is 120,000 times the force moving, creating a nice, basically, shock wave or a percussive air wave, which may have contributed to the falling of the next building, which only had a 10-story part above it. So let's look at the damage. When these buildings fell, we have actually 21 buildings that were damaged. So there's a whole series of buildings that damaged, besides the Twin Towers and this mysterious Building 7 back here, which has caused a lot of controversy. I'm not surprised that Building 7 fell when I look at the damage around here. One reason that people are concerned about Building 7 falling is that it fell 5 hours later. So here we have 21 buildings damaged. Let's look at some of the carnage. Here are parts of the building that are coming down. This is what's falling down on other buildings. We have huge parts of the trade centers coming down, crushing other buildings. Here's an aerial view, and again, this is available from our AccuNet database, which is a great resource here at the university. Here we have what was the North Tower, the South Tower. Building 4 is no longer in existence. Building 5 has large holes all through it. Building 6, the center of it's been obliterated. Here we have Building 7, which was the next tallest building in that area. And so to see all these buildings here with damage, and to see that one out here actually fell down, doesn't particularly bother me too much. Again, here we are, 4, 5, 6, 7. Everything around here was damaged. There's a close-up of Building 6, which is, I'll say in quotes, still standing. That's how they described it. Over here, Building 7. Another part of Building 6. Building 5. There. And we'll close this down here for a second and show part of Building 7. And here's the base of Building 7, which, when I was reading some of the different websites, they said, oh, well, this building came down, yet it wasn't even damaged. And here we can see from the 18th floor up a large chunk out of it. So to me, it's not surprising that these buildings did fall down. If it was a conspiracy to bring Building 7 down because it housed this bunker and housed all sorts of top secret information, why did they wait this 5-hour period to detonate it later? Because that's one of the conspiracies, was that this didn't fall on its own, that it was detonated at a later point because the initial detonation failed, and that the World Trade Centers wouldn't have failed by those planes alone, and that actually people had to load bombs into the World Trade Centers to get them to fall down. My gut reaction is that I just have a hard time believing that there are people here who would be willing to kill that many people to start this new world order. And I'll say I am not a friend of the current administration. I believe that they will try to manipulate data, scientific data, whenever possible, if it will help them with their agenda. And I do believe that the current administration has a neoconservative agenda, which has caused quite a bit of damage and carnage around the world. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Thanks, Dean, for the presentation. One thing that Dean's presentation will illustrate to you is that there are a wide range of theories out there for what happened on 9/11. And a couple of things to note in particular about Dean's presentation is that it didn't address the points that I raised. So you need to keep those things separate in your mind, because now I am going to start talking about a few of the things that he's been talking about. But notice that those other questions that I raised have not been addressed. But I also do want to emphasize that there are yet other theories out there about what happened on 9/11 that I assume Dean didn't address because he knew that it would be a waste of your time. Some of them are very ridiculous. I think Dean picked a couple that maybe people would consider to be a little bit more within the mainstream ideas about what's going on. There's one website that I'd refer you to. It's the WTC7 research website. That's run by a guy named Jim Hoffman. And Jim Hoffman's one of the best investigators. That's an excellent website. He's one of the best investigators on 9/11, somebody who I've learned a bit from. And Jim Hoffman does not believe that anything other than an airliner hit the Pentagon. So, and if you look at my short course, you'll see too that when I covered that topic, again, it was something, I believe that there are some severe irregularities around the Pentagon, but don't think of it in your mind as either it happened exactly as the official story would have it, or a missile hit the Pentagon. Those are two possibilities, but I think there's evidence for something in between, more along the lines of, these planes may not have been being controlled by the people who they say they were being controlled by. That might come up a little bit during the discussion, because there are actually known mechanisms for doing that. And the improbability of somebody with bad piloting skills actually having piloted that plane in. So there's a lot of sort of gray area there around the Pentagon. It's really not something that I've chosen to focus a lot of my time on in terms of thinking about this. But it is worth some attention. we'll be showing a video at the end that raises some of these questions too. A few more questions about the Pentagon. With the time I have here, I'd like to say more about the collapse of the buildings. And among those things, let's see. Just first to address a few things in Dean's talk that aren't in the PowerPoint I'm about to show. World Trade Center 7, so this is the third building that collapsed on 9/11. It was not next to the Twin Towers. There were other buildings that were between it and the Twin Towers that were damaged much more severely. Those buildings did not collapse. World Trade Center 7 housed, Dean called it the FEMA Command Center. It was actually Rudy Giuliani's Emergency Command Center. And that was on the 23rd floor. Another thing is, I'm going to focus on World Trade Center 7 because it was a building that was not hit by an airplane. And so the core explanations that Dean gave to you around the collapse of the buildings have to do with a plane, jet fuel, insulation being stripped off of the frame of the building by the planes. None of that happened in World Trade Center 7. It wasn't hit by a plane. And so if you really want to try to explain the collapse of those three steel frame buildings on that day, then providing an explanation for two that doesn't apply to the third really doesn't get you to a full explanation of what happened. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to say something here about World Trade Center Building 7. For me, it's the real crux of the issue here. One other thing that Dean mentioned that I'll address briefly now before I get into the PowerPoint is he showed a slide of some damage on the side of that building. Now that damage was trivial compared to other surrounding buildings that did not collapse. In addition, that damage was noted in a preliminary report put out by the NIST, and this is supposedly the definitive report on the building collapses. It was a $20 million taxpayer-funded report in which their task was to explain the collapses of the buildings. And in their draft report, they noted that damage. And I read the draft report, and I sent them about a 5-page peer review on that report. In their final report, they removed all mention of World Trade Center 7 from their final report. So they were aware of this information, and yet they did not put it forward as an explanation for why the building collapsed. In their draft explanation, which they did not release, at least officially, they released it initially, but it was not part of the last official report, they did try to use that damage to explain the building collapse. Now note, it was revoked later. So we still have no explanation from any official source for the collapse of World Trade Center Building 7. So in their draft explanation, they pointed to that damage and they said that, maybe that was part of what caused the building to collapse. However, in that draft report also, they said that the site of the initiation of collapse was different from the site where that damage occurred. So that was one thing that I pointed out to them. The other big difficulty that they had in trying to explain the collapse of World Trade Center Building 7 is that this was an absolutely enormous building. It might not look big because the Twin Towers were next to it. It covered an entire New York City block. And the big difficulty was to explain how a building that covered that much area could collapse simultaneously. How could a building go all down at once? In their draft explanation, they talked about some damage on one side, and maybe the building started to fall there, and as it fell, it knocked over adjacent regions of the building. And those then knocked over yet more adjacent regions, yet more adjacent regions. The trick was to try to explain how does a building that covers that much area all come down? And so that was their draft explanation. They revoked it. There's still no explanation for the building. And I think you'll see when I show these videos of the building going down is that there's no domino effect in terms of this building coming down. The collapse does not start at one site and you see the building kind of sloughing off and dominoing down. The entire building falls straight down into its own footprint at free fall speed, which is a signature of controlled demolition. To date, there's no explanation, alternative explanation for why that building came down. So here's World Trade Center 7, not hit by any airplane. It was more than 40 stories tall. If it had been in Oregon, it would have been the tallest building in the state. So let's see. I'm going to just show a couple of videos here of the building going down. Here's Dan Rather narrating the collapse of the building. Do we have sound for this?
And again, what you're seeing on high. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Now we go to videotape the collapse of this building. It's amazing. Amazing, incredible picture word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by world-class dynamite to knock it down. And
I believe, isn't there also just lots of people saying they heard explosions, like right before their secondary explosions?
Yeah.
I think it's caught on tape.
I'll get to that, but that's a good point. Here's another view of the collapse of the building. Well, there's a lot of material to cover, as you know. Okay, so the building collapsed, as you saw, straight down into its own footprint. Didn't damage surrounding buildings, at least not extremely, as it went down. This is from a website on how building implosions work. Ideally, a blasting crew will be able to tumble the building over on one side into a parking lot or other open areas. This sort of blast is the easiest to execute. Sometimes, though, a building is surrounded by structures that must be preserved. In this case, the blasters proceed with a true implosion, demolishing the building so that it collapses straight down into its own footprint. This feat requires such skill that only a handful of demolition companies in the world will attempt it. No plausible alternative theory exists. I've already touched on this. FEMA initially came out with this report saying the best hypothesis has only a low probability of occurrence. NIST, as I said earlier, still has not explained this. I don't think they ever will. Other problems with the NIST report on the building collapses. It's not peer-reviewed, so it has not been peer-reviewed by other scientists. And I'm a scientist, and science in general works the same way, regardless of your field. It can't be peer-reviewed based on the amount of information that was released in the report. The Twin Tower models, so this is getting a little bit away from World Trade Center 7, but the Twin Tower models do not work with realistic parameters, that's the wording within the report, and that more severe parameters were used. So if it's not realistic, then what is it? The Twin Tower models do not address the speed of the collapse, the symmetry collapse, other aspects of the buildings. So all three collapses were unprecedented. No modern steel-reinforced high-rise has ever collapsed because of an uncontrolled fire. This is from a New York Times article. The title of the article was "Engineers are baffled over the collapse of World Trade Center 7. Steel members have been partly evaporated." Molten metal in the rubble. They showed us many fascinating slides ranging from molten metal, which was still red hot weeks after the event. The pile there was raging hot for over 6 weeks after 9/11. So how much energy did it take in order to keep that going for that long? Remember, these are relatively oxygen-starved conditions down in a rubble pile. As of 21 days after the attack, the fires were still burning and molten steel at that point was still running, according to this newsletter of structural engineers. Okay, so what about the partly evaporated steel in the World Trade Center 7 rubble? Fires involving paper, office materials, even diesel fuel cannot generate temperatures anywhere near the 5,000 plus degrees Fahrenheit needed to evaporate steel. However, thermite, RDX, and other commonly used explosives can readily slice through steel. Thermite is a mixture of iron oxide and aluminum powder. The end products are aluminum oxide and molten iron. This is from a paper written by Stephen Jones, who's a physicist, was a physicist. He's stepped down at Brigham Young University. And this paper has been peer-reviewed, unlike the NIST report. Where has it been peer-reviewed?
I've heard him speak. He has not been peer-reviewed.
It appeared in that, according to him, it's been peer-reviewed by a number of different physicists. And they're anonymous, like, well, that's fine, but peer review is still peer review. And if they're, the individuals that peer-reviewed it aren't going to release their name, just like when I get a paper peer-reviewed, the individuals are not obligated to release their own names. I agree that this would be a lot stronger. And in fact, I've written to Jim Hoffman, too, who's released some scientific or his scientific analyses of other aspects of the building collapses. I've urged him to get his stuff peer-reviewed. Okay, other signatures of demolition. Horizontal puffs of smoke and debris are observed emerging from World Trade Center 7 on upper floors in a regular sequence just as the building starts to collapse. Since we're running short on time, I'm not going to go to that. You'll just have to take my word for it. I assume this information is going to be posted somewhere, so you can go to this website and look at the puffs coming out. And one of the interesting things about these is they're actually not going down, they're going up in sequence, quite clearly. Many eyewitness accounts, so this gets to the student's question, many eyewitness accounts reported descriptions, exact really descriptions of controlled demolitions. All of them are here. It took a Freedom of Information Act request from the New York Times to get these descriptions released. They didn't come out until about 4 years after the event. So they're all here at this site. Here's a few of them. Here's a firefighter from Engine 53. It actually gave it a lower floor, not the floor where the plane hit, because we originally had thought there was like an internal detonation, explosives, because it went in succession, boom, 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 and then the tower came down. Daniel Rivera, paramedic. It was a frigging noise. At first I thought it was, do you ever see professional demolition where they set the charges on certain floors and then you hear pop, pop, pop? That's exactly what, because I thought it was that. When I heard that frigging noise, that's when I saw the building come down. Another captain, somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, it was just one flash. Then this flash just kept popping all the way around the building. And that building had started to explode. These popping sounds and the explosions were getting bigger, going both up and down, and then all around the building. Now, one of the problems with these issues around the building collapses is that you can get one group of experts saying one thing, as we have from the NIST. You can have another group of experts saying another thing. However, we do have Building 7 coming down, and there are numerous people who have come forward and said that they were actually told the building was coming down and to clear the area. Those people could be interviewed under oath. We have the person who is the leaseholder of World Trade Center Building 7, you'll see later on video, saying, apparently saying, be good to get him under oath, but saying that the building, that they had actually made an order to pull the building. Well, you can see the tape.
I've seen it for 5 years.
Okay, well, we can debate it once it's shown. Let's see, how am I doing on time? Should probably let Dean come up. Okay. So let's end it there, and Dean's got 5 more minutes.
Well, I really don't have much else to say. So my big question is with Building 7 is why wait the time period to detonate this building, and what does it get you? That's where I'm thinking with this scenario. So that's I don't know if you have any comments to that.
I'm not prepared to speculate about what was going on, in terms of if you want to take the position that the building was detonated. I'm not really in a position to speculate what might have been going on in the minds of the people who were detonating it, if indeed that was what was happening. But there were fires burning in the building, And so, you know, it wouldn't have been plausible for that building to have just necessarily fallen down right away. If you want to have some kind of an explanation that's centered around a fire-induced collapse. You know, the building was cleared, and so if the detonation of the buildings was under some sort of control, then why not clear it before demolishing it? You know, those are a few possibilities. Another thing that's on Jim Hoffman's website is that there was a fair amount of apparently there was a fair amount of gold bullion being moved out from underneath the World Trade Center complex on 9/11. There was an armored car with gold bullion in it trapped down underneath a tunnel. And so that's another possibility. For me, that's a stretch because I don't know enough about that situation. But it does illustrate that, you know, for an event in which we don't know what all was going on, we're not really in a position to deny the possibility based on some sort of supposition about what might have been going on in the heads of the people who might have been conducting this. So I think, for me, the evidence is strong enough to merit further investigation. And, you know, there's all sorts of people who raise questions about, well, you know, if that were really true, why would they have done this or why would they have done that? Some people say, well, why would they have even destroyed the buildings in the first place if the buildings were destroyed? And there's lots of speculative answers that you can offer around that. And, you know, for me, I don't think it's really useful to get into that. I'd just like to see some of the people who we could ask questions of, you know, subpoenaed and interviewed under oath. So there's the leaseholder, Larry Silverstein. We know that a company that Marvin Bush was associated with was running electronic security at the World Trade Center on 9/11. I'd like to see some individuals from that organization interviewed.
But I don't want to ask another question, because I think at this point, I think I'd rather actually have open up to the audience and have them ask questions at this point, just in regards of time. So.
My name's Mark Rabinowitz, and I've been trying to figure this out from about 9:30 in the morning on September 11. And want to recommend Crossing the Rubicon by Mike Rupert is the absolute best investigation, and probably about the only investigation in terms of how the air defenses were turned off and why. I've known Jim Hoffman for about 4 years, and I've urged him all that time to peer review his material. I'm not a structural engineer. Jim's the only one who's looked at good evidence and absolute disinformation on the collapse of the towers. I don't care. I'm much more interested in the war games that the military and intelligence services were running, including a plane-into-building exercise at the exact same time.
Do you want to, just because some people here might not know anything about those, do you want to say something in a little more detail, maybe just 2 minutes of saying just a little bit about that, just so people know what you're talking
Sure.
about?
One of the main, my favorite analogy for it is, imagine if there was a bank robbery going on in downtown Eugene, and all the other banks were doing exercises on bank robbers, while half the police force was up in Portland at a conference on bank robbers. The honest officers who would be at the police station wouldn't know where to send the squad cars. On 9/11, you had the reason there were no planes scrambled from the nearest air base in the Washington, D.C. area is they were over North Carolina on a practice exercise without ammunition on board, so they couldn't have done anything. You had fake blips put on the radar screen. You had a plane-into-building exercise at the Spy Satellite Command Center. This was on the Associated Press near Dulles Airport. And so you have all this distraction and confusion thrown at the air defense system at the precise moment it was needed. The Terror Timeline book, which is somewhere circulating around in here, lists 15 countries that provided very specific warning to the Bush administration: what, when, how. From looking at this really closely, the conclusion that a lot of us came to is that they let it happen and made sure that once the planes were hijacked, then they turned on the remote control feature that Boeing calls auto land, and they have a patent on this, to make sure that the plane hit the empty part of the Pentagon, killing only 125, rather than hitting the other parts of the Pentagon, where it would have killed thousands and possibly have killed Donald Rumsfeld, who was on the other side of the building when it happened. The TV in D.C. was reporting the plane was coming in. And that's why, in my opinion, they made up all this nonsense about cruise missiles and smaller planes and space people and God knows what else hit the Pentagon, because it's not true. And there was never Donald Rumsfeld made up the story. So the debunkers point this out, and David Griffin, to his discredit, and we sponsored his second speech ever on this topic here in Eugene 3 years ago, got fooled by it and won't drop it because it's hard to admit making a mistake in public. Anyone who looks at this, you're going to make some mistakes, but it's better to learn from them and move forward. So
that's why I think for a lot of this stuff, the emphasis should be on asking questions. Do the questions get you to the point where you think there should be a more thorough investigation? Nobody here is going to solve exactly what happened on 9/11, but the issue is, are the questions sufficient to merit an authoritative investigation with subpoena power to actually get to the root of some of them? And that has not happened yet. The war games that Mark is mentioning are very well documented. They were actually raised during the 9/11 Commission report. And some of the NORAD officials actually commented on them. So the war games are not speculation. Those were going on. And the effects of the war games are covered in Crossing the Rubicon. You have to be pretty into the whole thing, though, to get through all of Crossing the Rubicon. I felt like he could have used a much harsher editor on that book.
I just want to say one final point, which is I've run into a Democratic senator, not from Oregon, who privately admitted at a political event when I asked him that he knew that Cheney was in charge of running the war games in the basement of the White House that morning while Bush was reading The Pet Goat to second graders instead of being commander-in-chief. In front of the microphone an hour later, he had forgotten that. And when the media focuses on what's euphemistically called 9/11 truth, they always focus on the demolition theory. They always focus on the no plane nonsense. They never talk about the warnings. They never talk about the war games, and there's a reason for that.
It's on.
It's on. Okay. Thanks for the presentation, and I was going to say that I recently read where NIST had admitted that they found no evidence of any fire that would melt steel. So they said that the fire didn't get hot enough to melt steel. So all of this molten metal that was seen in many of the videos pouring out of the buildings, I think still needs an official explanation.
Do you want to comment on that? Or
is this buildings 1 and 2?
On any building, this said from their analysis, the fire, including all of the paper and all of the plastic and everything, didn't get anywhere near hot enough to melt steel, let alone vaporize steel.
That's where I read that report too. What they do say is that the steel got hot enough to lose more than half its strength, so it just became, in a sense, soft. It was annealed. The material that was pouring out from the World Trade Centers, I don't know if that is part of the aluminum fuselage of the plane that's melting, pouring out. I really don't know where that came from. But again, the SNIT report indicates that the fire was not hot enough at all to melt the steel girders. And that was not a reason for them coming down, but the fact that they became annealed and soft was. So, question in the back, yeah. Or
actually, just a brief comment. I just got done watching Truth and Lies of 9/11, which is actually a Mike Rupert a production. He was done up here at Portland State University in November of 2001, and after having have seen a number of different conspiracies theories, quote unquote, he done just a beautiful job, I thought, of weaving in all of the information, right, and creating a cohesive picture. And being an investigative detective, right, once upon a time with the LAPD, he presents his information in a way the Bin Laden family, as early as January 2001, when I also found it really odd that no one was allowed to fly in the country except for the Bin Laden family. All of the family that was in the United States, they were immediately escorted right out of the country. And when you just add up everything bit by bit, piece by piece, it's obvious that something is fishy is going on, and at least it gives me hope to see that there's a small group of people here that are at least willing to look at this with an open eye. I mean, personally, I kind of feel that the American people are really desensitized. Perhaps even I would even go so far as to say stupid, right? Coming from and last I'll end with this. Mike Rupert, beautifully because I'm 30 years old, right? And I remember when the CIA crack cocaine thing broke, right? And it was no secret to the black community, right? That through COINTELPRO, right? That the government had been targeting, minorities for the drug trade for a long time, right? It was just so refreshing to see someone finally supporting what we had known what was going on all along. So when he approached John Deutsch, who was a leader of the CIA in South Central Los Angeles, and dropped the bombshell, it was just it was just beautiful, right? I mean, for me. But in the end, nothing has been done, in regards to the drug trade, even though there's so much evidence that our government is implicitly involved in the drug trade. So, and lastly, the Taliban had destroyed all of their poppy crop, and since the United States economy is determined, we need that liquid cash, right? From the drug trade, right? When the Taliban had destroyed their poppy crop, they produced 70% of the world's heroin. So when the U.S. went in there with the Northern Alliance, right? Within 1 year, heroin production went up by 94%, right? So we were on our way to eradicating heroin in the Golden Triangle. When we went in to Afghanistan, heroin, was back on the ball once again. So, lastly, he says 9/11 happened because of God, gold, oil, and drugs.
Well, it'll be tough to follow up such well said argument there, but I'll do my best. I've been studying this subject for a long, long time, and I'll remain anonymous, not to get blacklisted by the government. I'd like to go back to one point about the molten metal and the World Trade Center. I believe that if you go to a controlled demolition site, if you were to have access to the metal from the site through testing, I'm not into know exactly how they do it, but I'm pretty sure you can determine whether or not thermite is amongst those metals and amongst the rubble at the heat pile. So it just seems to me, well, grab some of that metal and give it a test. Does it have the thermite in it or does it not? Funny thing is that none of that information or any of those pieces of metal, according to my knowledge, are around anymore. They're immediately sent off to a place in China, which immediately recycled the steel and pretty much just they got rid of the evidence. I was wondering if I'm false in that or what you knew along those lines.
I mean, my view on this would be that I think that thermite was used. It would be detectable in the area, and that probably it might still be detectable there. I think if people collected samples from that area, and that not just the steel itself would be the only place to look. And that's something I certainly would think that would be, if that is a legitimate theory, that it should be investigated.
Thermite was found in the steel samples, and Stephen Jones, the BYU professor, the way it happened was very interesting. Very briefly, he put out a call and said, I think that the yellow metal flowing from the floors of the videos and other characteristics indicate thermite, but I'd really like to have some samples to test this. And even though much of the metal was quickly recycled, some samples were taken by firefighters from communities around the country and brought back home and erected into small shrines in front of fire stations and police stations. And one of the wives of one of the firefighters who had such a memorial erected in front of their police station had gotten the metal with some ugly yellow crust on it, and to make it more presentable for the city hall, she scraped all the ugly yellow crust off and put it in a cardboard box and meant to throw it out. But when she read on Stephen Jones' website that he was interested in analyzing the metal, she packed it up and sent it to him. And he analyzed it, and he found thermite. Now, as this fellow here and other people point out, there's a chain of evidence, and that could have been tampered with. But to my knowledge, the only metal that's been tested for thermite has shown thermite. So right now we've got a situation where Stephen Jones, I think, has tested two samples for the presence of controlled demolition explosives, has found it positive. Let's let somebody else come back and give more samples and more controlled samples and say that there is no thermite.
Let me just toss out a question here. I'm probably the person who, on this panel here, is very new to this field. How many people would need to be involved in this conspiracy to pull all this off? What is your feeling on this? And are all these people willing to be that murderous? So that willing to kill 3,000 people?
Can I say something really briefly to that? We have Operation Northwoods. It was signed off on by all the top U.S. military leaders. It did involve, simulated acts of terrorism in U.S. cities. If you want to ask questions about, our government and how much they care about our citizens, we could look at something that's more transparent, which is the ease with which they went to war in Iraq, the pretext there. The number of American servicemen alone who have died in Iraq now is roughly equivalent at this point to the number that died in the World Trade Center, and certainly the number that have been maimed or psychologically damaged exceeds that by at least an order of magnitude. And so the idea that our government is benignly looking after us and worried for our safety and occasionally makes some errors, but overall they're good people, is contradicted by that. And let me just bring up something that this gentleman over here raised, which is relevant to this issue, and that is the documentation that's come out now within the CIA's own internal report, which is that the CIA was trafficking crack cocaine into the streets of Los Angeles to pay for the Contra War. And that was raised by, investigative reporting was done by Gary Webb, a reporter at the San Jose Mercury News. If it hadn't been done, it never would have come out. He was run out of the Mercury News after that. None of the other mainstream media picked it up. And it took a report by the CIA itself to actually give the blessing to this information as being real, even though Gary Webb had accumulated massive documentation. It was one of the first uses of the internet to back up a mainstream media news story. You can read all about it in Gary Webb's book. It's called Dark Alliance. And it's completely straightforward stuff. It illustrates very plainly that these intelligence agencies are corrupt, that they'll do horrible things to Americans. And so the idea that they're just, that nobody like that would ever get into power in our country and do these things is blatantly contradicted by well-established, well-documented information.
Well, we also think that Washington is full of holes, that more people would come out making charges like able danger. I would think that those people risk their careers to basically mention that there was an initial spotting of Atta prior to 9/11, and he was being followed. I would think that there would be other people that courageous to come out and say, geez, we would have murdered people.
People have numerous FBI agents have acted as whistleblowers in the wake of 9/11. Indira Singh, who was head of computer security for J.P. Chase Morgan, and she has uncovered a very clear line right connecting the U.S. government, terrorist networks, and drug running. And it's the same networks that have been uncovered by Sybil Edmonds, who's an FBI whistleblower. Many people raise the objection that, well, if this had really happened, wouldn't we have whistleblowers? Well, we do have whistleblowers. They're out there. They're just not being reported. If If you want to look a little bit into the alternative media, read some of the books that are on this bibliography, you can see very clearly that go to the patriotsquestion911.com website and look at the whistleblowers. One other issue on whistleblowers that people get confused about is people have this idea, maybe this is similar to the fantasy that our government is looking after us. They have this idea that that somebody would crack and just come out and confess to this. But that's not the way it works. People who end up confessing are squeezed into confessing. The whistleblowers that we've seen come out are people who are within these organizations. They see the corruption. They're not part of it. But we've had lots of whistleblowers that have come out and said that this needs a lot more investigation.
So now we're at 90 minutes past our starting point, so we're probably going to wrap up for the evening. If you want to invite others to stay after the film release to watch the video, we can do that. But for the formal panel, we probably should conclude. So, Steve,
Steve, why don't you make the concluding remark?
Sure. Thank you. I'll do that. How many people here tonight are hearing some of this stuff for essentially the first time? Well, that's fantastic. So that's more than half. So I want to address you primarily. We've had a lot of discussion from people who have had a lot of time to delve into this, and not so much questions and answers from people who are hearing it for some of the first time. And I'll come back to my original point and why I wanted to organize this panel. It's that this kind of information is something that we should feel free as Americans to discuss, and discuss openly. We had this incredible attack on our country. Our country is an incredibly different place today than it was prior to the attacks. It's because of the attacks that it is that way. It makes sense to discuss it openly and to unearth all the truth. And I think both Dean and Matt are in support of that. I mean, I think that they have different perspectives on a variety of these things, but both of them will come to the conclusion that that we should have free and open access to all of the information. And we should leave no stone unturned. And so I would encourage those of you who are thinking about this for the first time to really take a step back and try and remind yourself, well, what does it require to have a critical mind on this? How do I remove my own prejudices from the situation so that I can evaluate it objectively? And you might decide, well, actually, maybe I do have a bias that the government is automatically on my side and only good people could get into power. And maybe, well, is that something worth examining? And how do you remove that bias or that from your thinking so that you can really evaluate this in the way that Matt says, just by weighing two different theories, not feeling that, well, I don't want to become a conspiracy theorist because then I'll be labeled with this group of people that are conspiracy theorists and they're all crackpots anyways. But it would encourage you to really evaluate the information as openly as you can and to evaluate your own internal your instincts and why you would allow yourself to be led down one path versus another. And it's when you're able to do that for yourself, as well as have the open dialogue with other people and not have a sense of fear of sharing your thoughts and your concerns and your opinions, that we have a free and open dialogue, which is, I think, was what most people in our country would want us to have in the first place. So I encourage you to take that next step, and this is really the first step, right? To just find out about a bit of information. The next step is to look into this the bibliography a bit more and ask yourself those questions.